Hey everybody, welcome to a new edition of Collider Connected. I am Collider's managing editor, Adam Chitwood, and today I am so happy to be joined by writer, producer extraordinaire, Damon Lindelof. Damon, how are you doing?
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
I do take issue with the word extraordinaire, but it's very humbling. Thank you.
And that's it for our show today. Thanks.
And goodbye.
Awesome. Well, I kind of wanted to go back a little bit and talk about, I know you've talked about being a fan of Star Wars and everything growing up, but when did you first know you wanted to be a writer? When did you know you kind of wanted to create stories yourself?
It does feel a little bit like it's just something that I always knew. I can't remember a time where I didn't want to tell stories. And so I think that there were certainly a number of pivot points once I left childhood and entered some stage of adolescence where it was like, oh, I can get paid to do this. So this is like a career. This is something that you can make a living doing. Understanding that I was very steeped in movies, television shows, reading books. So I understood that there were writers, and particularly writers that I loved, but I couldn't make the leap I didn't know any writers that lived in suburban New Jersey. So my mom was a teacher and my dad was a banker, and my friends had parents who were lawyers or doctors or owned restaurants or worked at restaurants and so like that, it didn't really feel like it was a viable career path until I was in middle school. And that was when I started telling people, what the answer to what do you want to be when you grow up was, I want to be a writer. And I think that probably in its earliest days, it was some version of I want to be Stephen King. I want to be a novelist. The desire to actually write television and movies came a little bit later.
For sure. Well, and I know kind of as your career got off the ground, you worked on Crossing Jordan, you worked on Nash Bridges, and then obviously you gifted us Lost, which is still to this day, people are talking about, discussing, debating, loving. I know for you, that was a bit of a trial by fire in that first season. You and JJ hashed out that pilot very quickly and shot it very quickly. And then JJ left to go do Mission Impossible. And you guys did something like 25 episodes, which was crazy. But then, the show, everyone, it took off. It was a huge success. Everyone loved it. You guys won the Emmy. So I was curious what your experience was digging into season 2 after okay, now I made it out alive of season 1 and people seem to like it and we won the Emmy. Now what?
That's such a good question. And it's one that I get asked very infrequently, because I would say that in the life after Lost, starting, the finale and was in 2010. So in the decade since it ended, there's a real focus on the very beginning, the period that you just described, the inception of the show and the making of the pilot, and to some degree the first season of the show. And then a huge focus on the end. And so that basically accounted to 4 hours of the 121 episode journey. But that time that you're describing going into season 2 is just as vivid to me as the beginning and the ending. And I think first to contextualize as it relates to the Emmy, and the time is a little bit, and memory is a little bit elastic here, but we would finish writing. We basically shot the season 1 finale around the end of April of 2005, and it aired right before Memorial Day weekend. And the reason that I know that is I was getting married. I got married in Hawaii, and everyone came. We were like, everybody come down early because we're going to watch the Lost finale, season 1 Lost finale together on that Wednesday night. And my wife and I got married on a Friday or a Saturday. So it was a couple of days before the ceremony. And then we got married and we went on a 1 week long honeymoon. And then we were back at work on season 2. And so basically the second week of June, we were starting to work on season 2. and we brought in a bunch of new writers, and having the experience of, so there's this core group of writers who have been working on the show for a year, and then these new writers, and then the way that the new writers saw the show Lost was much different than those of us who had been working on it. And so their perspectives and the things that they were interested in, I think, were much more reflective of what the audience was interested in. So there was a lot of talk about the Dharma Initiative. We already knew about Desmond and what he was doing down there, and that he was sort of a remnant of this group of hippies that we were initially calling the Medusa Corporation. That's how we would always refer to them in season 1. But like, it was time to now do the deep dive on and they wanted to talk about Dharma, and they wanted to talk about the monster. And so all these mysteries that we were going to now understood we had to really start dragging out, because we understood where we were in the race now, where we finished 25 hours of this thing, but we're definitely more closer to the beginning of the race than we are to the end of the race. So that energy that the new writers were bringing in was really cool. And then that was the work of the summer, which is we actually had like two or 3 weeks to actually just talk about what season 2 was going to be, what our story arcs were, designing the sort of tail section characters, and figuring out where certain episodes were going to land. And then we just had to jump in and start writing, Man of Science, Man of Faith, which was the season 2 premiere. So by the time the Emmys happened, which was in September, I believe, like we were already very deep in the second season of the show. Maybe had written 4 or 5 episodes and talked about the seasonal design. But the other thing that I really remember about that summer of 2005 is that, per your point of like the show had kind of broken through into that sort of zeitgeisty pop cultural phenomenon in a pre-Twitter era. So there wasn't like social media yet, but the idea that it was still a time where large audiences could sort of aggregate around a single thing. And I think Game of Thrones may be the last time that happened on that scale. And everywhere that I went, people were just asking me what was in the hatch, like all of my friends and colleagues, and anywhere my wife and I went on our honeymoon, it was like, what do you do? I'm a writer. What do you work on? I work on the show Lost. Oh my God, you have to tell me what's in there. And so it was a very exciting time, and obviously an incredible experience to win the Emmy. It's true when people say it's an honor just to be nominated. Like, I always kind of thought like that's bullshit. People just want to win. So I'd never been nominated for an Emmy before. After I'd been working in the business for maybe as a writer for 4 or 5 years, but just putting on the tuxedo and going through that entire process is very surreal, because it's simultaneously very important and very silly. Just all the pomp and circumstance around it. And then when we won, that was like the ultimate manifestation of surreality. But it was on a Sunday night, and we went into work on Monday. Like it was like we're breaking episode 7. So there was like no opportunity to rest on our laurels. And the season 2 hadn't premiered yet, or I think it was about to premiere right after the Emmys. So there was still a fair amount. We weren't like all walking around like, wait till they see Desmond. We really, there was so much expectation about what was in the hatch that we sort of felt like, if this doesn't work, it's the end of the show. Like, we're not going to make it to a 3rd season. And it always felt that way the entire time we were writing it. Not just because we're self-deprecating, writers who have imposter syndrome, all of which is true, but also because the audience was constantly threatening to leave. Like there were dual parallel tracks of, I love this show, I can't wait for Wednesday night, and if you make like 2 bad episodes in a row, or I start to get the sense that you're making it up as you go along and you don't have satisfying answers to these mysteries, I am going to bail on you. So it was sort of like, I love you, baby, but just so you know, you're one mistake away from me bouncing out of this relationship. So it was a very anxious time.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, people bring up like you have to have everything planned out in order for a show to work. And you look at Breaking Bad, which Vince Gilligan admits, like, we didn't know what the gun was for. We didn't know what this was for. But also, Breaking Bad is made in this era of 10, 13 episode seasons. Not only did you guys have to come up with that story, you were doing it on network television where every single episode, as you said, was do or die. You could get canceled. But you're doing 24, 25 episodes a season, which for some shows now is like 3 seasons worth of story.
That's like the entire duration of The Leftovers. We did
Yeah.
28 episodes of that. So that's just 3 more than season 1 of Lost.
Yeah, and so that's why I think the show works really well. But that's why I think it's so fascinating. You guys were one of the first shows, if not the first show, to negotiate that endpoint, to go to ABC and say, like, we need to end, and we need to know where the end is, and we need to know we need a shorter amount of episodes per season. And I was curious from your perspective. I think the deal was you got 3 additional seasons. Was that as the amount that you wanted, or did you guys want to end it sooner? I know all this happened during season 3.
I'm not trying to be diplomatic. I'm trying to give you the most accurate answer the way that I remember it, which is the conversations about wanting the show to end began as early as the pilot. You know, like one of the notes that we were just getting back from ABC was, you know, when are you going to resolve these mysteries? And once you resolve these mysteries, why are people going to keep watching the show? And level 1 of that was, well, we're going to be introducing new mysteries as we go. So hopefully for everyone that we answer, we've left a new compelling mystery, set up a new compelling mystery. And if we get that balance right, they're not going to stack up. I think that we can both agree that we did not get that balance right. But it's sort of like as you go. So if you look at Twin Peaks, for example, which is my favorite show of all time, and arguably the second season is not that great, but they by the time they revealed who killed Laura Palmer, they hadn't laid the seed on any other compelling mysteries to keep people engaged in the show, even though I was still much more interested in the Black Lodge and all the crazy shit that was happening around Laura Palmer's murder. But for people who were just like watching the show to have that question answered, there was really nothing in its wake. So Lost was like, okay, like what's in the hatch? What's up with the monster? You know, who's the original Sawyer? How did Locke get in the wheelchair? You know, like what is the nature of the island? Is it why does it appear to be moving? Who are the others? Like, so there were all these compelling mysteries, and so we were saying we want to have this stuff answered by the end of season 1, and this stuff answered by the end of season 2, and then the show basically ends after about 3 years. That was the initial pitch, and they were not even hearing it. They looked at particularly me, and Carlton came on about midway through season 1, and he joined the chorus of me. But they were just like, "Do you understand how hard it is to make a show that people want to watch? And people like the show, so why would we end it? You don't do that. Like, you don't end shows that people are watching." And so we got all the way to the end of season 2, and then tried to formalize the conversation again. And that at that point, it was formal because Carlton and I both had 2-year deals that ended after season 2. And so we were now negotiating for the future of the show. And they thought that they were in a monetary negotiation where it was like we were trying to get more money. And all we were trying to get was for them to agree to end the show. And so neither side blinked. And so we agreed to sign a 1-year extension, Carlton and I, with the understanding that we'd be leaving at the end of the 3rd season and someone else would be running the show. And right at that same time, Alias had ended. So Lost absorbed a number of the fantastic Alias writers, including Drew Goddard, who had already written some episodes of Lost in the 2nd season. Jeff Pinkner, who's incredible, was going to kind of be the heir apparent for season 3. But all this time, when ABC would be like, "Why do you want to end the show?" we were like, these flashbacks are finite. You know, you can do like 3 flashbacks of Jack getting drunk and like being self-destructive, or Charlie relapsing, or Kate running away from the marshal that is chasing her. But ultimately, that stuff, the first one feels like an origin story because you're learning about that person for the very first time. but all the other ones feel like you're just kind of treading water. So we're going to have to switch gears at it. We can introduce new characters who have new flashback stories, but people are invested in the old ones. So we're seeing we're seeing about 8 chess moves ahead, and it ain't going to end pretty. And they just didn't agree with us. The beginning of season 3 happens. Those 6 episodes air because ABC decides that they're going to split the season into 2 parts. They'll air 6 episodes, basically like from October to December, and then they'll resume again with episodes 7 through 21 or whatever it was in the spring, because the reruns weren't working and there was a lot of confusion as to when the show was on and when the show was off. After those 6 episodes aired of season 3, they finally understood. And we were not phoning it in or trying to spike the show. We always did our best. But it became clear that we were working so hard to keep the characters on the island. And it was starting to be immensely frustrating. And the flashbacks weren't good anymore. And other than the addition of Michael Emerson as a regular, and Ian Cusick as a regular, and Adewale and Michelle Rodriguez and Cynthia Watros, the tail section. Some of that stuff was working, but all the other stuff wasn't. And then they finally came to the table and we had a real conversation about okay, so they were like, we have agreed to let you end the show. And I was like, I can't believe I'm hearing these words, because not only them, but my own agents were saying this is never going to happen. And I was like, I just said to Steve McPherson, thank you. Thank you. This is what's best for the show. And he was like, and then he said, we were thinking 10 seasons. You can end it after 10 seasons. And mind you, we're halfway through season 3. So I'm like, first off, how do you think we're even going to get to 10? And that's really the same as saying we're not going to let you end the show, because how many drama series even get to 10 seasons? And I was like, I was thinking more like 4. And not because I was in a negotiation, but because we had actually already worked out the Oceanic 6 story to some degree, where we knew that a number of characters were going to get off the island. They were going to have a very miserable time when they were off the island, and then they were going to come back for the big finale, and we felt like we could kind of do that, and starting in the back half of season 3, and then have one more season 4, which would have been a full season of television, 20 some odd episodes to do it all. And they were like, how about 9? And I was like, okay. So the agreement was we landed on 6 with less episodes to give us more time in between seasons to sort of plan things out. And then, of course, the 4th season was cut short by the writer's strike. But everything else kind of went relatively according to design. Not to say that everything that we did worked, but we had a plan and then we executed that plan.
Well, it's a miracle it worked as well as it did, and I do think it worked really well. I'm a huge fan of that show all the way up through the end. And I'm a huge fan of the finale as well, which is very spiritual. And it's easy to say now, looking back on other things that you've worked on. It's like, oh, spirituality is the theme throughout this work, but it may have taken some people off guard then. But I was curious, as you did head into that stretch, you say you knew kind of the Oceanic, that story. Did you know the episode would be this kind of meeting in this kind of purgatory place?
Well, we knew a bunch of things. One of the things that we knew for a very long time was that the series was going to end with Jack's death. That would be the end of of his arc, as it were, to use screenwriter speak. But the symmetry of starting with his eye opening and ending with his eye closing felt like really good to us. But then, because Lost was a show that really reveled in nonlinear storytelling and to jump around in time, we started to become very enamored of the idea that although the final image of the final season would be Jack's eye closing, that we could show his entire experience post-death in some way, Trojan horsed inside the show. And how could we hide it? How could we actually give the audience what we felt like the audience had been demanding from the pilot, which is this purgatory? Are they all dead? So when someone asks you a question, I believe, because this is how it is with me, they're really telling you what they want, you know? And so, and I felt like there's a grand tradition from Rod Serling and Owl Creek and Sixth Sense on up that, you know, that the true growth of the human spirit actually occurs post death, you know, that's the heaven can wait. That's the scenario where you can, you know, free of the mortal coil, you can actually take a long, hard look at yourself and figure some stuff out before you ascend, descend, transcend, one of this, before you get sent somewhere. And so we all liked the idea in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the idea of the bardo, which was, you know, and I'm overly simplifying a vastly complex construct, but the idea of the bardo is like, it's a place that you go when you die, but you don't know that you're dead. And it is like Bruce Willis in The Sixth Sense. Spoiler alert! Like, if you don't know that about The Sixth Sense, but so he doesn't know that he's dead, and the entire purpose of being in this space is to come to the revelation that you have died, but no one's allowed to tell you. Like, it's like the Truman Show in that way.
Yeah.
So you can get pushed along the way or get hints, but no one can tell you. And so we were like, oh God, that would be a really cool thing to do in the final season. But people will know what we're up to unless we make them think it's something else. Is there can we disguise it as like as a time travel paradox? And so that basically led to us backing into season 5 so that the incident would end season 5. And so when you started to get presented with, you know, Oceanic 815 flying over a sunken island, your brain would tell you, oh, this is a parallel timeline where the plane never crashes. So that when we finally revealed, and it didn't feel like that was a finale reveal. It felt like once Desmond started waking up or gaining consciousness, or the Charlie of the parallel timeline remembered putting his hands up with like, nope, not Penny's boat, that the audience would start to get wise of like, how are these characters remembering events that never happened to them? The only logical answer is that they're in an afterlife, but kind of, I didn't see it getting widespread theoretical attention. And so, but that's why season 4 needed to set up, you know, time travel into the Dharma times, et cetera, all in service of that grander idea. How we were going to do all those stories, and the fact that Jack had a son, or that Ben Linus was a substitute teacher, like, John Locke, but Ben Linus was a teacher and John Locke was a substitute. Like, all of that stuff came in the organic story breaking process of season 6. But like the big ideas were generated in these mini camps that we would have with the writers in between seasons, primarily between season 3 and 4, and then in the post-strike period between 4 and 5.
Well, as I said, I think it ended really beautifully, and it's interesting to hear you describe how you guys come up with it, because that sounds really hard, really challenging. I was curious, you know, moving into kind of your feature film career, you worked on the first Star Trek and the second Star Trek, worked on Prometheus with Ridley Scott. Was it kind of refreshing to kind of get out of the serialized storytelling and work on these big franchise films? What did you kind of learn playing with someone else's toys, essentially?
Yeah, it was refreshing. I mean, I think that the part of the job that I enjoy the most is the creative parts, you know, talking with other people, figuring out what the story is going to be, and then actually writing and rewriting the script. And it's also cool to make it, you know, to be on the set and be a part of that entire process. But the part of the job that I always hate, because I'm quite bad at it, is the managerial aspects of it. You know, the like, I did not go to business school, and I'm the more effective I am in my job as a creative is that I'm not thinking with my business brain about budgets, which you have to think about, or personnel, and in any given time there's just like a dozen managerial issues that need to be solved. on a television show. And so the relief came from when Lost was over, I wasn't the net anymore. In TV, you're on the wire and you're the net, so if anyone else falls, you have to catch them. On Prometheus and the Trek movies, I was just on the wire. And so in JJ and Ridley respectively, they were the net. And so I think that the idea of someone else being in charge is an immense relief. The challenging part of that is that you're servicing their vision. You can argue all you want with someone about what you think it should be, but ultimately they're going to say, thanks for your input, but this is what I'm doing. And so, you're more a part of the president's cabinet than you are the president. And so this isn't to say that I'm not proud of or that I don't take responsibility for any of the movie work that I've done, but it is less responsibility, awesome, but also it's someone else's show. And I think that part of some of the challenges, certainly that I experienced on Prometheus, as much as I loved writing for Ridley, was that I'd spent 6 years kind of like controlling my own domain. And so sometimes I would say to him, like, we can't do that. And he would just look at me like I had like thrown a drink in his face. And I'd be like, shit, right. Like,
You
yes,
told Sir Ridley Scott we can't do that.
We can do that. Yeah. Sir is right. I mean, he's got a sword and everything. So, yeah. And also he's the greatest guy. Like, I mean, I was so incredibly intimidated by him always, but like, just like a wonderful human being. And the work experience was incredible, but he thinks in very visual terms. And he would sketch things out on napkins and sort of like hand them over to me as he would just pitch what was happening in a scene. And so part of my job was just like transcribing visual images into actual words. And then obviously I was contending with the studio, and in that case, Fox, in an entirely different way than I would with ABC. Because one of the benefits of doing TV is like, yeah, you're getting notes, and a lot of them are good notes. Like, but you don't have you have like a 48-hour window to be like, what are your thoughts? Got it, thank you, and then you're moving on. With Prometheus, there was like a year of back and forth about what the movie was going to be. And you didn't have the traditional leverage of we're shooting tomorrow, so we have to resolve this thing. So you end up iterating a lot of different versions. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, which is that I think that John Spates, who basically wrote the draft of it wasn't called Prometheus, I think it was called Alien Zero or something like that, or that might have been its working title. But I thought it was great. And I was like, when I read it, I was sort of like, why aren't you guys just making this? And the thinking was that if they were going to make a prequel, they didn't want it to feel like it was just another Alien movie. Ridley had already kind of done the face hugging and the chest bursting, and there had been a number of Alien sequels, some great, some less than great, but he was really interested in the idea of the engineers and the idea of what did it look like for man to go seek out his creator, his and her creator, in a sci-fi context versus a religious context. And for all the reasons that you said earlier, that was that was a fastball in the strike zone of things that interest me. And so I was like, yes, let's do that. But I think that those two ideas, the horror movie and the sort of like deep thinking philosophical hard sci-fi that is sort of more germane maybe to Blade Runner, we're constantly trying to find what the balance between those two things was. And with Fox having a very specific idea of what they wanted it to be. And normally I would interface directly with the studio. That wasn't really happening on Prometheus. Ridley interfaced with them, because I was working for him. So I think that as much as I loved working on that movie and both Trek movies, the lesson learned at the end of it is I think I'm better at TV. I think I'm just better at it. for all sorts of reasons. The main one being, it's really hard to cram like ambitious storytelling into 2 hours. And I always want to be ambitious, and I also don't want to write a 3-hour movie because I feel like it's self-indulgent. Like if you're gonna have a 3-hour movie, like be Tarantino, like, or Scorsese, or like, and even that said, like the main gripe on The Irishman is that it's too long. But sort of like, I just have too many ideas and am interested in too many different characters to just stick them all in 2 hours. And so it ends up feeling a bit half-baked, I think, in its final assessment.
It's interesting you say that, because I like Prometheus quite a bit, and I also find Tomorrowland really fascinating, but it's hard not to think Tomorrowland would make a really exciting kind of anthology TV show or something.
I agree. And that was, Tomorrowland is one where I had a tremendous amount of creative control, and working with Brad Bird was literally like something that I wanted to do since I saw Family Dog on Amazing Stories. And he's a genius. And Disney gave us a tremendous amount of, creative latitude. And I think they took a real risk on that movie because it was hard to define what it was. And I'm really proud of what we were going for. But I do think I agree with you where like a 10 episode, Disney Plus version of Tomorrowland would have worked much better than we had done working with Jeff Jensen, who I co-wrote the movie with, along with Brad, of course. All the world building that we did like amounts to basically like, 5 minutes of screen time, but it was disproportionate in terms of how it was represented on screen. But some of that stuff was the most fun stuff we talked about. And I think you'd be able to service a lot more of it. It's particularly that idea of like, how did people view the future in the 1950s versus the way that they view the future now? The big idea of like, at what point did it go from being a utopia, the Jetsons, flying cars, things are better, to a dystopia? And the answer is like somewhere in that space of, the late 60s and early 70s. It's Vietnam. It's the civil rights movement. But it's like the broader understanding of these things that we were told post World War II are not achievable. The line is heading down, not up. And then to basically say like, can we reverse that course? And it's almost like, we'll take full responsibility for how Tomorrowland turned out. And every movie is you're experimenting as you go and figuring things out. But I think like ultimately the real challenge of it is that the culture just rejects the idea of optimism in any movie that's presenting a future that is better. You just kind of go like, I don't buy it, like, I just walked into the theater from the world, and then I'm going to walk out of the theater back into the world, and the world is not giving me any indication that things are going to be better.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, I'd love another crack at that one.
That's I think I would have loved to have seen more of that Tomorrowland future that they were building out. I think that was something that people were really curious about. But then also just how that whole organization worked and stuff. I think you get a really interesting vision, even now, years after you guys made Tomorrowland, of what that version would be, because the world has changed so significantly.
Agreed.
Before I get into Watchmen, I have to ask you about The Leftovers, which I think is just one of the best shows of the last few decades, and it's curious that you jump into Leftovers after Tomorrowland and kind of these big blockbuster things. And something I was curious about is that it's upfront in that, like, we're not going to tell you where they went. The theme song is Let the Mystery Be. I was curious how conscious that was of you, of like, all right, this is what I'm doing now. This is the kind of story. And did it feel like a good fit once you got into it?
I was extremely conscious of it. And in fact, that was like, to me, like the primary drawing point for the material, and also the clarity by which I was like, this is a TV show. Because I think that the idea of like, imagine a scenario where the central mystery is never going to be resolved, and then telling people that up front. And so it's they don't have to opt in, but you're just completely and totally, there's like a waiver on the show that says, hey, if you're interested in learning where the 2% went, the show is never going to tell you that. So just know that going in. And doing everything that I could when the show launched to make sure that the public understood that. And of course, I think that probably contributed to the diminished ratings of the show, but it was also like, it just freed us of any anxiety. And this is a show that I was able to partner with Tom Perrotta on. And so I think that the system in our business is very often that Hollywood falls in love with the book, and then they buy the book, and then they broom the person who wrote the book. So it's like, I love this thing, and your input is no longer required. And it doesn't really make sense to me. I understand that the writing of television and movies is a highly collaborative, and authors tend to be less collaborative because they are completely and totally in control of their worlds. But, Perrotta hired me. It wasn't the other way around. There were other writers and showrunners who wanted to do The Leftovers, and he interviewed them. And I think one of the things that I said to him is, you probably aren't going to want to hear this, but you're going to have to work on this show, not just the pilot, but the show. Because my inclination is going to be to pull it into crazy town, and your inclination is going to kind of be like, there's a supernatural thing that happened, but the show in and of itself is not supernatural. And I think that our tug of war is going to lead to a really interesting show, but you have to be there, and it's going to be a real creative partnership in addition to all the amazing writers and directors and storytellers that we brought in after that. And so, but I said to Tom the first time that I met him, I was like, okay, the door's closed. You got to tell me, just tell me, where'd they go? And he was just like, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? And he goes, it never interested me. Never interested me. And I was like, oh God, I don't even know how that's possible, but I love it. And so it was a really difficult first season. Season ones always are. The show is kind of telling you what it wants to be and what it doesn't want to be. You force it, you hold it too tightly instead of letting it roam a little bit. And again, I have to check my calendar, but I think that The Leftovers pilot and Tomorrowland were happening simultaneously. So they were both getting made at exactly the same time, because HBO greenlit The Leftovers pilot right at the same time that Disney greenlit Tomorrowland, because I thought Tomorrowland was going to happen a year after it actually did, but because just it takes a long time. But they really liked the first draft, and George Clooney had a limited availability window, and it was like, and so did Bird, and it was like, so we're going. And so switching between those frequencies was not ideal. But then Tomorrowland was finished. And for seasons 2 of The Leftovers, I was monogamous with The Leftovers. And that's when I started hearing what the show was telling us it wanted to be. And of course, in addition to Tom and again, the incredible writers, there are so many names that need to be mentioned. Jackie Hoyt, who was there in seasons 1 and 2, Patrick Somerville, Leela Bayek and Carly Rae in season 3, Tamara Carter, dozens that I'm not mentioning. But Mimi Leader is really the unsung hero of The Leftovers, because she was really running the show just as much as the Toms, in addition to Tom Spezialy, who came in season 2. And I credit Tom Spezialy with giving more of a narrative structure to The Leftovers. He had just seen Picnic at Hanging Rock and The Last Wave, and essentially was like, is there a way to make the show, even though you're not going to answer where The Departed went, can we hang central mysteries, more into the body of the narrative structure? So the disappearance of the 3 girls and Miracle, Texas, which was an idea that we had in the previous season, started to kind of build the episode still had individual identity, but there was also sort of like, if you watch this season, you will find out where those three girls went.
Yeah. I just think that's a really tremendous achievement. And I think Justin, Carrie Coon, God, is incredible.
Oh my God. And Regina, I mean,
and Regina, yes.
Not to mention Kevin and Kevin Carroll and Scott Glenn and Margaret Qualley and Chris Zilka. I mean, like, the cast on that show, and Dowd. Holy shit!
Yes.
Like, I mean, off the charts.
Well, and then
Christopher Eccleston. He's like, I'm forgetting like some major, amazing actor from The Leftovers.
The line, "That's the guy I was telling you about," is just forever iconic.
He put wood on that ball.
And then you decided to tackle something super chill and easy, which is Watchmen.
Let's just kick back. Let's pick something that no one will give a shit about.
It's really like, I don't understand. I don't understand how good it is. Like, and I've been rewatching it recently, and it's even better than I remembered, and I remembered loving it. It works simultaneously as a love story, as a superhero story, as a race story. And I was curious. I mean, I know you had been offered it a few times and had said no. And I know the Ta-Nehisi Coates book kind of inspired a specific vision for you, and setting it in Tulsa and bringing in the Tulsa Race Massacre. I was curious, and knowing full well this is a conversation between two white men, but as a white man, how did you approach telling a story which is ostensibly about race? Like, Watchmen is about race. That's what this show is.
Are you in Tulsa right now?
In Tulsa right now, yes.
So do you mind if I ask you a question?
Sure.
Which is, when you were coming up through, you were born and raised in Tulsa?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Like, what was your interaction with the massacre? Like, I mean, you didn't hear anything?
No. So there is this like nebulous idea of like the Tulsa race riots, which people had talked about, but it was not taught in schools. I've asked my friends, like my mom, who's lived in Oklahoma her entire life, no idea. Like, just had no idea. Right. Which is kind of the point of the show, is like, well, let's just sweep it under, and it didn't happen.
And that's, that's there's this sort of like, there's a thing in like sci-fi where, and the first time that I saw it employed as a device was in Stephen King's book, It. And so, as you may or may not know, It takes place in two different time periods. When the main characters were children in the 1950s, this is the book, and when they're adults in the 1980s. And one of the sort of like central ideas of the book is that when the kids defeat Pennywise in the 50s, they forget that it ever happened. Like, this sort of, it's like a weird supernatural effect as they all sort of like, they leave Derry, which is the town that it happened, and it isn't until they're in their 30s or early 40s. I guess it's most of them are like in their late 30s or early 40s. They get summoned back to Derry, but they don't really remember. They remember each other, but they don't remember what happened, and that they have to fight this thing again. And so, when I first read about the massacre, I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book Between the World and Me. That transformed. Like, that was the Matrix. I got, what's the opposite of getting red pilled? But anyway, it was like, I just saw the world differently. And then I read everything that he wrote. And then he wrote this article called The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic, which, for everyone who's like, I wish I knew about Tulsa, read, take an hour of your life and read. I think it's one of the most important pieces of writing about the moment that we're in, written half a decade ago. In that article, he mentioned the Tulsa Massacre, and it's just a paragraph, and mentioned Black Wall Street. And I had this sort of weird, like, Derry sense of like, I feel like I've heard about this thing before, but I forgot it. And my brain was like wanting to forget it because it couldn't hold the fact that 300 people were murdered and massacred, and this incredible, like, sort of like, Black utopia, for lack of a better word, like, was completely and totally wiped from existence. I almost felt like I was being gaslit. How could, and so I just went on to Wikipedia. I was like, is this the Mandela effect? And there it was, the whole Black Wall Street, the Tulsa Massacre, all this, a wealth of information. And then it started getting becoming sort of an obsession. So I read this book called The Burning by this guy, Tim Madigan, that kind of goes through gives a history of Greenwood all the way, and that like sort of sets it up and all the people there before the massacre begins, and then contextualizes the massacre to the best of its ability. And when it was over, when I finished the book, I was just like, I started talking to everybody that I knew about it. And this weird thing happened where I'd be like, have you ever heard of Black Wall Street, the Tulsa Massacre? They'd be really interested for like 30 seconds. White people, let me just say, mostly. And that's not a slight on them. I would have done exactly the same thing. Really engaged. And then their eyes would kind of glaze over. And I was like, they can't hold it either. Like, they don't know what to do with this information. It was 100 years ago, and makes them feel really bad. It makes them feel bad because it's yet another instance of the destruction of Black enterprise and basically like the pillaging of their wealth to the benefit of white folks. And so there's this sort of feeling of like, Damon, what am I supposed to do with this information? Why are you telling me this? And so I was like, no one will ever opt in for a story about Tulsa 21. No one, like, if I tried to produce a documentary on it, or try to involve it, like, and I could see, by the way, when I Googled it, that there were a number of film projects, like Morgan Freeman was trying to, but nothing ever was happening. And I think that that's because this thing that I'm describing, kind of the glaze effect, is like, wow, that's terrible, but I really wish you hadn't told me that. I'm Joe Pontiliano. I just want to enjoy my steak. Like, and so I was like, wow, I don't know how to do this. And most importantly, it's not even my story to tell. I'm a white guy. Like, I'm one of the looters and the destroyers and the murderers. So why should I be talking about Tulsa? And feeling sort of disappointed that I felt compelled to share this information, but didn't know how. And then that is when I got the third call. Damon, please do Watchmen. And if you say no, respectfully, we're going to move on. We're going to get somebody else to do it. And I started feeling, what if I could combine these two things in some way? What if the Tulsa Massacre, because Watchmen can hold, as anybody who's a fan of the original Watchmen knows, that Watchmen can hold actual history, and particularly ugly history. Moore didn't want to talk about World War II. He wanted to talk about Vietnam. And so I think that comic books are not good at looking at United States history in any real way. That's why even in the DC books, there's no New York City. There's just Gotham City and Metropolis and Central City. So it's like they're not even happening in the real world, because those comics don't want to solve for, why isn't Superman doing anything about Hitler? So I started becoming infatuated with that idea. And then as soon as I understood that I was going to be not only appropriating Watchmen over Alan Moore's wishes, but I was also going to be appropriating the story of Tulsa, the Massacre of 21, which is not my story to tell, that Watchmen had to be entirely about Tulsa. It couldn't just be a footnote. It had to be the central idea of it. And the characters, the two heroes of the show, and this isn't to take anything away from Laurie Blake or Looking Glass or even Adrian Veidt, but it's Will and Angela's story, and they are both orphans of Tulsa. That was the beginning, and then the Hooded Justice thing came a little like right on the heels of that, but that was the thinking.
I'm curious, when I was rewatching it, I was really struck by something that James Walk's character says, which is that I'm tired of being blamed for something my ancestors did, that I didn't do it. I didn't have slaves. And it's something that I've heard from people say in real life a lot. And something I think this show does really well is showing that systemic racism, and how it kind of festers and infects. And there's a really interesting article in the Huffington Post by an author named Xavier Blay about, is the show propaganda or abolition?
Yeah, I saw that.
You recently talked about how you purposefully cast Don Johnson because he is seen on TV as like a nice cop, and you're casting him as this man who doesn't think he is a racist, but is a racist. But then also that systemic racism, you have, in this extraordinary being, you're seeing how the infection of the police and the Cyclops happened so long ago and is still persistent today. I was wondering how you kind of approach that and displaying that systemic racism.
I mean, the first thing that I have to say, which is critically important, and I know that you're well aware of it, and and Steve is, and everyone that I've talked to over there is, but it's when you say you, I know you're not directing the question directly to me, because this show was basically born of the most collaborative writing process and this is not me just checking the box of this is the politically correct thing to say. Sort of like anybody who was there will tell you that this writing process was very unique, and that I don't feel like I was the traditional showrunner, and that like, yes, we're going to do that. It was like we almost had to reach unanimous consent on every idea for it to get out of the writer's room. So it functioned more like a jury room, of which I was the foreperson, and as opposed to that I was the judge and I would issue rulings on what we did and didn't do. And this is key in terms of answering your question, particularly as it related to police and policing. I talk a lot about the makeup of the writer's room as being populated by people who didn't look like me or come from the same background as I did. But we also had a writer named, a fantastic writer, producer named Crystal Henry. And she's African-American, ex-cop from Chicago. So she was a cop in Chicago for 7 years. And I think that having a cop in the room with us, who is also a writer, was essential in starting to modulate these questions and the complexity of how much of your identity is a cop if you're also a Black woman, like, and so we talk about this idea of the police are this versus the way that you traditionally approach story from a writing point, which is like, this is a person and their job is that they are a cop. And so let's ask and litigate the question, why would they want to be a cop? Why would they choose that profession? But to define them solely by their profession feels like not the right approach for storytelling. Now, clearly, we're in a moment of great reckoning in our country where we're talking about, systemic white supremacy in our institutions, most pointedly the police. And I think that this idea of having that reckoning, everybody's sort of like contributing, but to your point earlier, a lot of white people are sort of saying like, well, this isn't my fault. Why are you getting mad at me? And I'm not hearing the conversations or participating in the conversations where anyone is saying this is Damon's fault.
Yeah.
All they're saying is, Damon, you're a beneficiary of this system, because if you come home at night and your window is broken or your door is ajar, you can call the police and you don't even think that you might be shot and killed by the police. And I want you to think about that and why that is versus it's your fault that it's that way. Nobody's using the word fault, but I think that acknowledgement, like seeing what our real history is. And this is what this all goes back to Tulsa, right? It was erased. It was buried. And Tulsa's not the only one. There's hundreds. And before Tulsa, there was the Trail of Tears. Oklahoma was basically taken from the First Nations indigenous peoples. So, so it goes back and back and back and back. And I feel like white people feel in our bones and in ourselves a different kind of trauma, which is we know that we stole this shit and we don't know what to do with it. And so we get angry and say like, well, I'm not the one who stole it, but we are the ones who are spending it.
It's really striking. And it's fascinating that the show is able to address these issues and do that so well, but also be compelling and entertaining, and this really tragic love story, and also like work as an echo of the graphic novel. I was curious kind of how you threaded that needle in terms of kind of ticking those boxes? Because you're telling a bunch of different kinds of stories here, but I think they're all firing on all cylinders.
And I really appreciate you saying that. And I do think that it's important to say, like, we threaded that needle very, very clumsily, and I think that's the beauty of a threaded needle, which is if you just look at it after it's done, you're like, hey, that needle has thread, and now I can sew. But that's after you've been doing this for 15 minutes. And I think, like, that's the perfect analogy and metaphor for the show, which is there was a tremendous amount of experimentation, many roads gone down that yielded negative results. So you have to walk all the way back and start over again. When you hear an idea and it feels exactly right, it illuminates everything around it. And so, but it took, on and off, close to 15 months in the writer's room with a dozen different people to generate those 9 episodes of television. And that's putting aside the Herculean effort that was employed in Atlanta and Wales to make the show. And so we knew that we wanted to be super ambitious. We knew that we owed Watchmen the source material, the Old Testament, that we owed it, like, it had to have sacred status for us. So that talking about the canon and not aberrating from the canon actually was terrifying. But then when we would find ways to do retcon, because hooded justice, the idea of hooded justice in general, that was not, Dave Gibbons was a consulting producer on the show. I assure you, he was not like, oh yeah, this was our idea. We wanted hooded justice to be a black man who had to basically disguise his racial identity in order not to be murdered by white folks in the 1930s. But when he heard the idea, he was delighted by it, Dave was, because he thought that was in the spirit of the initial Watchmen, which is, it was sort of like kicking the shins of superhero-dom, the original Watchmen, but also revering it. So, like, the Watchmen kind of had to do both. And when we were engaging in this kind of mischievous, like, tear it all down energy, we knew that we were in the slipstream of Watchmen. But when you tear it all down, you make a mess. And so I think, and I've used this metaphor before, so I apologize for reusing it, but I haven't heard a better one, which means someone else must have come up with it. But it's like, it was the process of writing the show was like setting a bull loose in a china shop and then, like, cleaning everything up afterwards every day, like, and then putting new china on the shelves. Like, the destruction part was really fun. And then the putting everything back in place part was much less fun. But the plotting of the original Watchmen is so brilliant that, and crazy. Like, when basically you say, okay, the story of Watchmen is about that this character named the Comedian is murdered. So it's a whodunit. And when you say, like, okay, whodunit? And the answer is Adrian Veidt. And then you say, what's his motive? And the answer is because the Comedian, happened upon Adrian Veidt's plan to save the world, which involved cloning a gigantic psychic squid that would kill 3 million people in New York, but at the same time prevent the United States and Russia from launching their nukes at one another. Then people go, what? That's the stupidest thing that I've ever heard. But it's so beautiful. It's a crystalline structure, just like Dr. Manhattan's, constructions on Mars. Like, the narrative of the original Watchmen is just so incredible. And so when that's the bar that you're trying to meet, and you want to have mystery and revelation and surprise and a sense of humor and characters that are, neither heroes nor anti-heroes, but just people who put on silly outfits, like, all of those things, it's a recipe for disaster. But it's my favorite kind of writing, because if it's a recipe for disaster and it turns out to be anything other than a disaster, that's a win. Like, it shouldn't have worked. It's a miracle that it did.
I know you have to go soon, but I wanted to mention that the casting of the show is incredible to a T, but I wanted to talk about Regina King, who is just incredible. And I was curious what this isn't, maybe explaining to her what your initial conversations with her were like, because this is not a straightforward, like, you're going to come in and play superhero, because it's also about race and Tulsa and systemic racism and policing and all of these other issues.
Yeah, I mean, Regina is obviously a brilliant actor. That's what most people know her for, but she's also a director and a producer and a writer and a student of history. And so, I'm not just talking to Regina, the actor, I'm talking to all of the above. And fortunately, we had a pre-existing relationship coming out of The Leftovers where we shared a mutual trust. And I was very reluctant to approach Regina to play Angela because I thought she'd say no. First and foremost, because after the second season of Leftovers, she'd only signed on for 1 year. But she appeared in an episode of season 3, but she was really interested in starting her directing and producing career. And so I felt like it would actually be insulting to her in some way. She'd done Beale Street, and I don't think she'd won the Oscar yet, but everybody was buzzing about it, and she's incredible in that movie. And so I was like, I'm worried that if I go to Regina and say, do you want to do this TV show, that she's going to feel like I wasn't listening to her, that I'm seeing her just as an actor and not as the multi-hyphenate powerhouse that she is becoming. And more importantly, I've never worked with the same actor twice from project to project. And I like it. I like that process because when you're working with new actors that you've never worked with before, you can find the character together. There's no preconceived notion. I'm discovering what their capabilities are as an actor, and they're discovering what my capabilities or lack thereof are as a writer. And I like that dance. It's really exciting. It's like I'm a happily married man. I'm going to be monogamous to my wife, but I don't have to be monogamous to the actors that I work with. So every project can be a new group of people. And so from the jump, when I pitched the show, HBO was like, so Regina. And I was like, she's going to say no. And we should look for we should look for some fresh faces. That's what TV does. Like, I saw Regina for the first time on Southland, even though she'd done 227 and a number of other things. But I was sort of like, maybe we should find the actor who was Regina then. Like there are any number of people who can sort of play this part. And they were like, great, you go try to find them, but Regina, right? And I was like, she's going to say no. So we went through the entire process. While we were writing the pilot, in the writer's room, instead of saying Angela, I just kept saying Regina. And it became sort of a joke with the writers. And until it was finally like, just ask her. So I sent her an email and I said, I don't know if you've heard, I'm doing Watchmen for HBO. They've greenlit the pilot. Can I just send you the pilot? I don't want to really, I don't really want to tell you anything about it. I just want you to experience it, and then we'll talk. And then I think she called me up because I remember talking to her, and she was like, I've wanted to like kick ass. Like I've wanted to be like a superhero since I was a little girl. So just before I read this, because my sense of Watchmen is that it's a superhero thing. And I'll be very disappointed if I don't get to beat anybody up. And I was like, you do beat some people up in the pilot. So I can't make any promises after that, but she wears a cool costume and she beats people up. And she's like, okay, I'll read it. And then she called me the next day and said, are you free for dinner tonight? And I was like, this is probably a good sign because she's not going to invite me out to dinner. And then like, while we're figuring out what we're going to order, she's going to say, I'm not doing the show, but she could be doing that. Like, so I didn't really know what to expect. And then we ended up having like a 3-hour dinner, 2 hours of which were spent talking about Tulsa, because it turned out that Regina had been developing an idea about Greenwood to produce for quite some time. And so when she read the opening of the pilot, she was like, this is how we're going to do it together. And kind of the rest is history. And she's just, there are no words. It just goes well beyond the limits of hyperbole to talk about what an incandescent talent she is.
She's phenomenal. And I know she said that she'd be interested in coming back for a season 2 if you came back. Are you still kind of tapped out on a season 2?
It's not even about being tapped out. It's more about me feeling like wanting to honor what Watchmen was before I became a part of it. And that the legacy of Watchmen is Alan and Dave created it. And it sat for 30 years. Obviously, Zach made his movie, which was a pretty canonical adaptation of the 12 issues. And then we made our season of television, and that was my turn. It's like I got in the middle of the dance floor for a minute and got to do my move, but then you retreat to the edge of the circle, and it's someone else's turn to dance. And this is a horrible metaphor because you don't want to see me dance under any circumstances. Suffice to say that I just feel like what's best for Watchmen, this thing that I love, is for someone else to take their shot at it. And I think that that's just going to be much more interesting than anything that I would do moving forwards. And it's not that I take the opportunity for granted or that I wouldn't, I've learned that not working with actors again is stupid. So I would love to work with Carrie Coon again, and I would love to work with Gene Smart again, and Tim Blake Nelson, and Justin Theroux, and Kevin Carroll, and Giovanna Depo, who I worked with twice now. Like these actors in the world of Watchmen, but at the same time, like unless I have an idea that is important to me as Tulsa 21 was, then I shouldn't do it, and I haven't had that idea. And I want to create the space versus people are waiting for me to change my mind. I want to create the space for people to come forward and say, I have an idea. And I issue this invitation to anyone out there. If you have an idea, figure out a way to pitch it, but probably not to me. But like Watchmen is not mine. It's ours. And I want to see how someone else interprets this incredible story.
My last question for you, supposing this is the end of Angela Abar in this story, I'm curious if you feel like the show ends on a hopeful note, because we've seen Hooded Justice tried to get justice and failed. Dr. Manhattan, with all his powers, her grandfather says he could have done a lot more. Rooting out systemic racism is hard. As we saw in the show, and Dr. Manhattan didn't solve poverty and he didn't solve education. Supposing that Angela does inherit his powers, do you think this ends on a hopeful note?
If you were a lawyer and I were a lawyer, I would demand that you rephrase that question, because if I answer it, then it explicitly agrees with the premise that she is a god. If I say it's hopeful, so let's just say we're going to stay in the ambiguous space of not answering that. But what is clear is that she is willing to become a god, because why else would she eat an egg?
Yeah.
Or step in the pool in the way that she does. So she's accepting the challenge, a challenge issued not from John Osterman or Cal Abar or Dr. Manhattan, whatever you want to call him, but actually a challenge that is issued to her by her grandfather. The last thing that he says to her is, talking about Dr. Manhattan, he was a good man, but he could have done more. And so now we get the sense that at least Angela is signing up for doing more. So whether or not it works out, I think that that's basically the call to action for all of us right now, and not to pivot back into the real world. But that's what always gives me optimism. That's, that was the idea in Tomorrowland too, which is like, the future is something that it's not something that happens to you. It's something that you make happen. So by showing Angela is willing to try to do more, like that's the clarion call for optimism. And so if we're basically saying, I don't think that this moment is going to lead to a better future, then that's the way. What I'm hearing is, so you aren't willing to do anything about it, and so when you see all these people in the streets, and Lou was just talking about this the other day, I had, the benefit of being on a panel with him, and he was wildly optimistic about the moment that we're having right now. And understandably, Yahya wasn't cynical, but he was concerned that it was fleeting, or like what's the perspective that I should have in this moment from one of our elders, who's basically seen the American century in an entirely different context. And so, like, I would say that this ending is just as hopeful as the ending of the Old Testament, the original Watchmen, which is there's a single character who holds in his hands the ability to expose this plot of Veitz. He's holding Rorschach's journal in his hands, and he doesn't know whether he should throw it in the kook pile or whether it should be published. And his editor says to him, "I leave it entirely in your hands." And so that's the idea, is like, it's just as much as hopeful as it is in the eye of the beholder. If you see it as hopeful, then it's an optimistic ending. If you think that she's just going to sink to the bottom of the pool and it was just like sort of an elaborate prank that Cal played on her, then that holds true too. It's a Rorschach test, but it's a comment more on the person who's watching it or reading it than it is on what actually happens next. Though I think that you and I both know there's going to be more Watchmen. Like, I mean, that's going to happen. And whether or not the individuals who decide that they want there to be more Watchmen pick this story up where it left off, or they do an entirely different kind of Watchmen story, that's up to them. But I am seeing, like, a lot of people who respond to the show are catalyzed and interested in what the world would look like if it were being reshaped by Angela Abar. And I don't have good answers to that question, but that's why it cut to black when it did.
Well, Damon, thank you so much for taking so much time to talk with us today. And thank you sincerely for putting Tulsa on blast. Like, this is something that I'm glad for my
Hey, you guys are having quite a year.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's classic 2020 over here.
Well, I'm going to be there for the centennial next Memorial Day. So, so let's try to have a coffee or something.
That'd be amazing. But seriously, it has, like, the renewed interest has spurred the city's leaders to, they've been looking for these mass graves that were dug for the people that were killed. And it renewed interest in finding them. And I'm sure you saw the Black Lives Matter that was painted in Greenwood.
Yeah, I did. And I saw that Mayor Bynum, I saw him on 60 Minutes basically sort of committing to that once the COVID crisis was over, whenever that happens, that they would be resuming the exhumation or at least the discovery of what's down there. But on a more optimistic note, there's also this incredible Greenwood Rising project. Anybody who wants to learn more about it should Google Greenwood Rising, but they're building a state-of-the-art museum sort of along the same lines of, and with some of the same individuals involved as in the Legacy Museum, the Brian Stevenson Museum in Alabama, which is incredible. And I had the opportunity to visit when we were making Watchmen. I drove down from Atlanta with my family. But Greenwood Rising is going to do what Watchmen didn't do, which is it's going to talk about Black Wall Street before it was destroyed. And I think that there's a lot of focus on the massacre itself, and it's important because it's horrific. But I think that there also needs to be a focus on what it was before it was destroyed, because that's the story that needs to be told just as much. And so they're raising money and they're close to their target. So if you're looking for, I know that these are trying times right now, but if you're looking for a good place to donate, the Greenwood Rising Project is a great one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much again. Thank you for Watchmen. Thank you for all you've done.
My pleasure, man. Thanks for your time.